Let's get started. Why not,
Yeah,
right?
why not?
This is what we all wanted. So the first thing that I wanted to point to is that I hope that everyone is spending the time and preparing for the upcoming season. My wife and I were speaking about it last night. We can already see people coming into town. We can already see the transporter trucks coming in from up north. So they will come, and we just have to be ready to service them as best we can. And that's a really good point. And Dad, you and I are going to talk about it in a little bit, but these are most of our clients, therefore, are also from out of town. And that with that comes certain biases, certain misunderstandings that are bound to happen. They take what they've always known in the past and they're kind of converting it to South Florida and wanting to buy something down here or possibly selling or even leasing. And so keep that in mind that most of our clients don't know what is normal. Their definition of normal might be very different from our own. Dad, you had a little bit of that, even you coming into town, 37 years ago. Um,
Back
you know,
when Jesus,
and from Massachusetts to Florida and just what that was like back in the day. It must have been, I would think, in a sense, this area was kind of like the Stone Ages.
I remember even when I was 18, my father made me go to the Burt Rogers Real Estate School, and you'd get the people moving down from Michigan saying, "Well, back home in Michigan, we do blah blah blah," and it became apparent at an early age that each state, and even within each state, when you look at Florida, things are done differently. There
Yeah.
is no homogeneous way of doing a real estate closing throughout the entire United States. The state of Florida has multiple different ways of doing a closing and multiple contracts. So I multiply that by 50.
Yeah, exactly. And I've said it a lot since I made my own, uh, you know, travel down here. I spent a lot of time in Atlanta doing contracts and closings up in that area. And the quickest way for me to get used to the contracts down here was to dive into the as is contract. And I know that's not the standard around here. It's not the go-to,
Mm.
but it is the simplest contract for a buyer or a seller to understand. It doesn't have election periods and response times. You don't have to define cosmetic versus defect.
Cosmetic and general repair items or defective
Right.
items.
Right. You don't have to do any of that. It's you got a free look, 10 days, 7 days, 5 days, whatever it might be. And that's Farbar or Nabor. They work the same. And
Mhm.
you had this question pop up recently, Dad. They found some repairs. They had done an inspection, a couple of things they wanted to fix. And they said, well, how long does the buyer have to make their election? What'd you tell them? What kind of advice did you give them?
The realtors who it was a husband and wife, and they've been doing this for like 30 odd years. They had 14 repair items requested by the buyer. The buyer was an elderly widow whose husband recently passed. And some of them were kind of silly, like, we want you to take photos of all the smoke detectors. That's what they wanted the seller to do.
Yeah,
Uh,
that is silly.
and then wanted the realtors actually to get involved and do it. And the realtors are in their 70s. And, I told them, one, you need to talk to the selling agent, um, find out which ones are deal killers for the buyer if you can. Uh, if there are things that are minor that they don't want to do, like they didn't want to take pictures of the smoke detectors, they didn't want to do something else that was quite analogous to that,
Yeah.
mainly because of their age and their health and all that. Tell the selling agent that, gee, I would love to help you out, but we're in our 70s, and I'm not good on a step
The
ladder.
first thing you did is you try and kind of convince your buyer to be a little more practical.
Right, and
Because
but
this is
also
not a defect versus cosmetic question. This is like, hey, how do we make
it's
it
not.
more?
But you got
Yeah.
a widow on one side, and they're asking for stuff, and it was a 10-day due diligence period. Said rather than telling the buyer to go pound sand, which is what they wanted to do, I said, you tell them, I would love to do it, but I'm lousy at this, or I have certain physical infirmities, or I'm the kind of guy who can look in a refrigerator and not see the milk, which is me. I mean, I get clients who ask me to go check the progress of the construction of a house, and I say, I'm the last man on the planet you want doing that. I mean, I'm a decent
No,
lawyer.
yeah, it's true. You have to draw the line in the sand. What do you do? What do you not? But
Yeah.
contractually, what should they do once they kind of bury it down to that?
Well, once they find out that, and what the deal killer thing is and what the seller is willing to do, you come up with an addendum, and we're going to do this one thing. And then also, and I had to call him back to remind him of this, make sure that in that addendum, the buyer is waiving the balance of their due diligence period, so they still couldn't come back for a second bite, or even worse, terminate the contract, which we had happen in the last 3 weeks. If you don't throw that extra sentence in there when you're doing your amendment, where the buyer waives the balance of their due diligence period, you're still uncertain whether the deal is going to go forward or not, and whether the buyer is going to want more stuff. And you look really foolish with your
I put
customer
in
if
the
that.
chat feature kind of the language you might use in an amendment. And you mentioned addendum. People make a big stink about is an addendum, is an amendment. There's a difference,
I don't
but
think it
really,
matters. I mean,
it doesn't matter.
it's in a law school exam. An amendment is when you're changing something in the contract, and addendum is when you're adding something. It's that
Right.
simple. The
So let's
court care,
assume
no.
so you take either form, you use a blank amendment, blank addendum, and you put
Mhm.
together the following language. Seller shall repair or replace the following items at its sole cost and expense prior to closing. And then you bullet point it and you say,
Yeah.
replace the AC and patch the roof, fix the shower handle. And you put it all in there. You have the buyer sign it. You send it over to the listing agent to have the seller
Well,
sign it
but
as
I said
well.
again, you add the sentence that the buyer, by executing this amendment or addendum, whichever form they use, waives the balance of their due diligence period. You want that to be it. You don't want the buyer coming back for more or terminating.
So I'll put that in the chat feature as well. So this was something you and I talked about that a listing agent should request or require when
Oh,
agreeing to certain
absolutely.
repairs. Because the thinking is on a standard contract, you can't ask more than once for a lot of these repairs, but on an
Right.
as-is contract, you certainly could.
It could be
You could
Chinese
ask as
water
many
torture.
times as
They
you
keep
want.
coming back.
Now,
Um,
timing wise, Dad, when does this amendment need to go out and how long does the seller have to respond to it?
Within the due diligence period.
Perfect. So you have a 10-day due diligence period. Let's say on day 5, you got your inspection. Day
Right.
6, you discussed it with the buyer. Day 7,
Right.
you discussed it with a listing agent. Your time frame starting to get a little smaller. So at that point, we want to make sure the amendment goes out to the listing agent at least a day or two in advance of the end of the due diligence period so that the seller can review it and respond. Now, what
Right.
if the seller doesn't respond and it's 11 o'clock at night, the last day of your due diligence period? What do you do?
You can terminate up to 11:59 at night.
You
That's
might
standard
have to.
contract.
You might have to. So you have until the end of the day, 11:59 on both contracts to send an email, send sort of termination saying the buyer hereby terminates. And that doesn't mean the deal is dead. It might mean the deal is dead, but what it does mean is that you've protected the buyer's earnest money and that that money would come back to the buyer. And hopefully the seller would come back to the buyer saying, hey, we're sorry. Here's the amendment. We signed it. We'll
Yeah,
happily do
and
it.
I've actually done that, Christian, where we've terminated and then come back the next day with a new offer of the credit to the buyer for the amount we wanted.
I've had it a couple of times where the seller was out of pocket, where they couldn't get in touch with them because they were on a plane or they're elderly. So I have had it, and you might have a listing agent who's like, oh, we're going to get it to you. We're going to get it to you. And it just never comes. So what I would do is I would tell the buyer, hey, look, you got 2 options. We can terminate, protect your deposit. We'll try and get back under contract tomorrow when the seller resurfaces. Or we can trust that the listing agent's telling us the truth, that this deal will come through, and we can just keep it together. You always mention, Dad, you're either protecting the deal or you're protecting the deposit. Very rarely are you doing
but
both.
the buyer has to decide which one is more critical to them. Where I see it a lot is in divorces. One party wants to sell the
Yeah,
house, the other one does
absolutely.
not. And that's the last time I terminated, within the due diligence period. And then we submitted an offer the next day because I knew the divorce lawyer, and I knew, I think it was the husband in that case, who was dragging his heels about conceding anything just because of the whole
Yeah.
divorce and the trauma of that. And there was a court-appointed, I think, mediator who I knew would essentially cram it down the husband's throat. It forced the husband to move. So
So
when you have
Angie had a
inside
different
info,
scenario. This was a different one that I have had before. What if the
hmm,
seller is still under builder warranty and is submitting defective items to the builder to be remedied? How would you word that in a repair request? Come across this several times lately. You might be surprised by my answer, but I would actually do it the exact same way.
yeah,
So, because at the end of the day, the buyer doesn't care who does it. They don't care who pays for it as long as it's not them. So what we do want is the builder is not a party to the contract. The seller is a party to the contract. So I still want the seller to agree to do these repairs at its sole cost and expense. And then if they can get it warranted, great. That's
yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
Love
I
it.
actually agree with you on that. I don't. I mean, I look at it like,
Shocking.
yeah, shocking. It's an insurance policy. I don't
Yeah.
care whether the other side gets their money. I really couldn't care less. Just
So I would
disagree.
write it the same way. I did have once where the seller required that we add that language into the amendment. So we said, seller is making or seller shall make a warranty claim on these items. However, in the event the builder doesn't fix them, the seller is obligated to fix them. And see how
Yeah.
it's a lot of extra words. It doesn't change one thing.
Well,
So
back to our example where you had 14 different things the buyer wanted, I told them also, if there's something big and you have an estimate from, say, an air conditioning company, you want to be as specific as possible on what you want done if you're the buyer,
yeah.
or even if you're the seller. This is what we agreed to do, and they have a repair invoice from Joe Blow Plumbing.
Yeah, we
We
don't.
agreed to hire Joe Blow Plumbing pursuant to the attached invoice, which was for $128 to fix the leaky pipe
Yeah.
under the sink.
We don't want
Be
to be
specific.
referring to the inspection report more than we have to. We want to say something along the lines of, seller shall repair the dishwasher, not, page 18, section 4. We don't want to
No,
say that. We
but what
want to
I'm
see
trying to
exactly what the seller
avoid
is
is
obligated to do.
the biggie I'm trying to avoid, and I see it a lot. You'll have an inspection report, and they'll say evidence of leaking in the bathroom. The sheetrock's wet. Well, that's not really telling the seller what's wrong. I mean, you're seeing a symptom, but you don't see what's causing the wet sheetrock.
Right. Right.
So if I'm the seller, I'm going to respond and say, we're going to hire Joe Blow Plumber, and we're going to replace this particular plumbing pipe under the sink. And that's the response. Now it's up to the buyer to figure out, will that fix the wet sheetrock or not? Or they want us to cut it out and
Yeah,
replace
I'll
it
give
and paint
another
it?
example on that. When my wife and I were buying a house, we found mold and we determined, all right, let's do some research. So we found the company we liked, the guy who answered the phone, and they gave us a whole scope of work.
Right.
And then the seller, unbeknownst to us, did the same thing. And so we
Yeah.
both talked to the same company. We both, and so when we made our amendment request, we said seller shall hire mold
This,
remediation experts following with the following scope of work, and we attached the estimate to the contract, so it was very clear that if the seller hired anyone else, they'd be in breach. And if they didn't do all the items on that invoice, they would also be in breach. So that was helpful.
and an indirect benefit of doing it that way is that it reduces something that's philosophical almost. I have a mold problem, that could be a small dollar issue, a big dollar issue, we don't know,
Yeah.
to something that's just money. And if the estimate is for $1,500 to remediate the mold, the seller is going to look at that as a $1,500 broken anything.
Yeah.
The mystery of it's not a blank check anymore. It's not going to be a $40,000 remediation. They know it's $1,500.
So I went totally off basis. That was not what we were supposed to talk about, but
Oh, you told me.
it's not what I told you. What I did tell you was an email that I got yesterday, an update in the case of Burnett versus NAR et al. And this was the opening paragraph I'll read to you. I have an important litigation update. After an 11-day trial in the case, Burnett versus NAR, the 8-person jury in Kansas City federal courtroom came back Tuesday and found NAR and other corporate defendants liable in the case. They lost. Now, some of you may have been following this and some of the other cases that relate to it, but there's the main arguments of these cases are that sellers have been paying commissions of the buyer's broker, and the buyer didn't know. It wasn't disclosed, and it led to some sort of unfair practices, some consumer transparency issues, ultimately raising the price of homes that people have been buying. Now, I feel like most buyers, maybe not all of them, but most buyers realize how this is made, how we put this all together. But they have an argument. If it wasn't disclosed to them in writing, and it later maybe had some driver on the price, that is unfair. That is kind of a problem. And this is the first big case that kind of confirms that belief. Now, it is trial court. It will almost certainly be appealed by the defendants that were listed in it. And so we're far from having any sort of resolution, but it was somewhat, important to note, because this article I thought was interesting. At the end, this is the NAR president. They gave some suggestions, and Dad, I thought it'd be fun if we kind of go through them and kind of maybe pick apart a couple of them. We'll see what goes. So next steps legally and the timing, far from over. They're going to appeal it. They're going to appeal it. Not only are they going to appeal these types of decisions, but all the ones that are tied to this similar thing. What do realtors, brokers, state and local associations, or MLSs need to do differently because of the verdict? I thought this was really important. They touched on 2 different topics. NAR has, number one, emphasized for many years 2 things. One is that buyer representation agreements, which maximize transparency by putting all agreements in writing to ensure clarity and understanding, should be used. Buyer brokerage agreements. Dad, you've spoken about this before. We've written articles about it. But generally what it does is it says, hey, I will work for you, and I'm going to be paid by the seller. They're going to share commissions based on what's listed in MLS. But in the event they don't, here's what I'll be charging you. That's basically what it says, right?
Yeah, I call it the loyalty agreement. You know you're not going to lose your buyer. You know they're not going to shop realtors. You know they're not going to walk into an open house and not, you're not going to get paid. So there's so many other benefits to it in addition to, fighting this case.
Right. I find that it makes a buyer, like you said, more loyal. It makes them feel more tied to you, even if you would let them out of the contract if they asked. They're not going to go to a builder or somewhere else and negotiate a deal without involving you on that. And so it kind of keeps you connected for as long as that agreement is there. So once again, they're specifying, use the buyer brokerage agreements. Now, let me step back. I said at the beginning of this video that a lot of people don't use the as-is contract. Well, guess what? A lot of people in this town do not use the buyer brokerage agreement. So I'll get that out of the way first and foremost. I realize a lot of people do not use the buyer brokerage agreement. I get it. This will be a big change for us if we have to start using it. That being said, in other parts of the country, it is very normal to use buyer brokerage agreements. Going back to Atlanta, it's the only reference I really have. Every buyer had to sign a buyer brokerage agreement. There were very few that did not. And I remember when it was explained to me when I was a buyer, the realtor just said, hey, this is our agreement. It outlines what I'm going to do for you and what you need to do for me, and we're going to work together to find a house for you to buy. He said, look at it. If you have any questions, let me know. But if you don't have any questions, go ahead and sign it. And guess what? I signed it. Of course, I signed it. He also
it was standard procedure in Georgia. This is what we use.
And I guess I'm telling the story. I think it can be standard procedure here, and it starts with the individual. It starts with the person. So if you think about your brokerage, they require a lot of things, and require is an interesting term in my mind because, for example, I know a lot of brokerages in town require that you submit a seller's disclosure to complete the file.
Right.
Well, they're not legally required, are they, Dad?
They're not required to give you a sales disclosure at all. They're required to disclose latent material defects because
But
that
that's a
constitutes.
requirement to the buyer, not
No,
necessarily something that the brokerage can demand, but we do it anyways, right? We've
they
made it
do it anyways, I
normal.
think, to avoid litigation.
Yeah. So, and
And
interestingly, in Atlanta, seller disclosures are probably used a lot less. Now, they still have the same law, case law that says sellers should disclose hidden or latent defects. It works the same way, but there are more sellers that don't do it. And I think it's driven by the brokerages. I think the
Well,
brokerage,
what I've seen, Christian, over the years, when the realtors would not use the seller's brokerage or the seller's disclosure agreement, post-closing, after you close, the buyer moves in, finds something, and gets quite upset and generates a huge amount of phone calls to both the selling realtor and the broker. So it takes up a lot of time and it leaves your customer being unhappy. Surprise, people don't like to be surprised. And, when you have a scenario like that, you're less apt to have that person come back to you or to refer a business to you. So brokers insist on it, honestly, because, you can't have Mike Hughes on the phone all day long answering unhappy buyer questions. And it protects the seller. The buyer can't, if the market goes down, if the stock market goes down today, you can't have a buyer change his mind because the market went down and say, well, I'm really upset because I didn't know the air conditioner was 12 years old. Because
yeah,
they do that a lot too.
yeah.
The reason they give you is often not the real reason.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the number one, is that they really want us to use these buyer brokerage agreements more. And I'm a fan of that. I think you can easily insert it into your spiel, into your intro to a client. You're going to give them a lot of other things, depending on what brokerage you're with. You're going to have some affiliate disclosures. You're going to give them some sort of HOA disclosures, things from the MLS. Add
Yeah.
this to that process, and you're going to have them e-sign it anyways. It's very straightforward. The second thing, it's imperative for members to continue to express that commissions are negotiable and set between brokers and their clients. Explain how local MLS broker marketplaces promote equity, transparency, and market-driven pricing for consumers, and persistently communicate the incredible value agents who are realtors provide. Did you get the sales pitch there, Dad? Did you feel that? Felt
Well,
that?
you got to sell yourself. I mean,
You
that's
do, yeah.
what you add to the equation. Again, most of these people are from other states, other countries. They don't know anybody in this town. They don't know who to go to for certain services related to the closing. You do, you have experiences. Plus, people who may or may not have certain properties that are about to go in MLS but aren't in MLS yet. They might be marketing it within their own company. So there's a lot of value a realtor can add. They just you got to believe it to sell it.
So, Dan, you and I talked about this, and my mantra is that everyone involved on a transaction should be bringing something to the table. We should be
Value added, right?
making the parties better. But to the extent that we're not, we might be disposable, right? So
Yeah,
if you have a title
exactly.
company or an attorney that is becoming more and more of a problem, maybe they're making it more complicated than it needs to be. And maybe they're not responding, they're not communicating correctly.
Right.
That's a problem. You gotta get rid of that title company and that law firm, and you got to hire someone who will bring something to the table that will make us all better. And the agents are no different. So the agents, if you have someone that's, not responding to emails, not doing their research, not trying, not being a good person, not only could you not be disposable, but you might actually get fired. You could get let go, you could be
You
kicked
got to
out of the
show your
deal.
value. I
You've
mean,
got to be.
our company. I mean, it was based on free legal advice to the realtors.
Yeah.
We had to distinguish ourselves from all the other title companies that were out there, and there are a ton
Yeah.
of them.
There are a ton of them, and you do need to distinguish yourself in that way. And I think realtors, if you take lackadaisical approach, these types of lawsuits are going to be a problem. But if, the people that are watching these videos and educating themselves, I give you guys credit. It takes a commitment to put in the time. So continue to do this, stay on top of it. And going back one on those buyer brokerage agreements, the big problem that people tend to freak out about is when it specifies how much the buyer is going to have to pay to you, or if you transact on the deal. And
Right.
so you have to actually put a number in there. It's usually like 2% or 3%. But remember, what it says is if the seller doesn't pay my commission, then you will be obligated to pay it. And so that's when buyers freak out, like, oh my gosh, this isn't okay. I don't like this. And you say, look, it's just about loyalty. If we go sideways, if I can't find you something, you're not going to owe me anything. If
Mhm.
you find a deal and I'm not part of it, if I'm breaching my agreement, I'm not responding to your emails, I'm not showing you around, then you're not going to have to pay me. I'd be defaulting under that. But it says, if I do everything I said I'm going to do, and I find you a great place, and the seller refuses to pay my commission, then you and I are going to have to work something out. I've never
Yeah.
had a problem with it. I
And
think if you
again,
explain it right, you're okay.
circling back to an earlier comment, it also cures a host of other problems that realtors run into on a routine basis. Your buyer on a Sunday going into an open house on some new development and not putting your name down, or your
Yeah.
buyer meeting another realtor at a cocktail party and trying to dump you. So it keeps them loyal
I
to
know in
you.
my own case, it was something that I wasn't worried about, but I always had on the back of my mind that I do have an agreement with this person. And that
Yeah.
meant
Well,
something.
you
It
may
was,
have a problem with 6 months from now.
yeah, I have a, I have this ongoing thought that I've got to be fair with this guy. I agreed to pay him in the event he helps me
Yeah.
find a place. That's fair. I think that works. Now, going forward, what else do we need to think about in regards to these lawsuits? Let me give you the worst case scenario is that NAR gets dissolved and the MLSs allow you to put $0 payable to the buyer's agent, and all of a sudden buyers agents are going out with a tin can looking for tips. Obviously that would be a worst case scenario. I think that's a pretty extreme scenario, but it goes back to, if you're driving value and helping your clients, you will get taken care of some way. There will be a value add. Someone will pay your bill, and you just have to be transparent. You got to get it in writing. I think that's pretty straightforward. Dad, one last thing on this topic. You went through this a little bit with title insurance.
The Butler case.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Butler case. So if I give you the quick summary, the Butler case basically led to title companies can negotiate down, they can give rebates or discounts to buyers or
Right.
sellers who are paying title insurance. And obviously that freaked a lot of people out in the title industry. And they thought, well, how are we going to pay the
Great to
bill?
everybody. I mean,
So, but
everybody was
what did you learn from that experience? Because it obviously didn't make us extinct. What do
it's
you take
it's
from that?
kind of funny, Christian. I mean, everybody was frightened. How are we going to pay the staff? People aren't going to pay the 70% premium. I actually, at one point, would think I thought I was being clever. When I got a large deal, I would offer the buyer a credit off the bat because think psychologically he won't ask for more because I've already been generous. And then maybe 5, 10 years ago, I said, let's try a year where I don't offer any credit whatsoever and see how many people ask. And I no more than two in any given year. And in every single one of those years, one of those two, I could talk out of it. It was usually a surgeon. I don't want to pay it, and that sort of thing. And then when you tell them all the benefits of it, they would go with it. So
Yeah.
me being clever, me
But it
trying to
didn't change the core of the business.
no, people,
Yeah.
people would not credit a significant portion back or anything at all because we're putting time in it. If I'm spending
Yeah.
all day in a closing, I'm not doing it unless it's a family or a close
Yeah.
friend or some realtor who sent us 8 zillion deals. It's not happening. We have
So I
bills.
guess the key takeaway in my mind is these things happen. What it should do is it should force us to reevaluate who's bringing value and who's not. If you're
Yes,
a valuable cog in this wheel, then you'll have a place. It may have a different name, it may have a different style, but it's going to be the same. A couple of people asked us a few follow-ups. That buyer brokerage agreement, is it a legally binding document?
absolutely.
Absolutely.
It's a
Now it's
contract.
between you and the buyer. So if
Oh,
the
the
buyer breaks,
broker and the buyer, right?
right, right. If the buyer breaks your agreement, the broker could go after them for unpaid commissions because they were in default, things of that nature. Daryl asks, when is the best time in the process to have a buyer prospect sign a buyer agent agreement? I think it depends. What I had happen to me was we went out shopping, right? We spent the whole day looking at houses, and at the very end, he, very very well, I thought. He came to us and said, we stopped the car. We were parked in the side of the street. He said, "Hey, here's everything. I've got a folder for you. I've got a copy of a probable sales contract, what we'll be expecting to use when we make an offer. I've got some disclosures about our company. I've got our buyer brokerage agreement as well." And he said, just look at the buyer brokerage agreement. If you have any questions, let me know. If you don't, feel free to go ahead and sign it and send it back to me. And then his assistant followed up with me the next week. Hey, I can send it to you via e-sign. Just let me know. I thought it was very well done. He did it after he kind of built the rapport. He did it after he proved his value, that he was very intelligent about the communities we were looking in. It was really smooth. And here's the reality. What if I said no? If I said, you know what, I thought you were great, but I really don't want to sign the agreement. I'm kind of a stickler and I don't like X, Y, and Z. If I was the realtor in that case, I would think, all right, I know who I'm working with. I'm working with a
Hmm.
stickler. I'm working with someone that is afraid to commit to me. So I better not commit too much to him or her.
Yeah.
I better be a little
But do I want
careful.
to waste my time on this
Yeah,
person?
this might be someone who's going to ask me for a discount. This might be someone who's going to, kind of hammer. This is how they're going to handle contract negotiations.
The
Let's
whole
make sure we're the
closing is
right.
going to be like this. It's going to be a nightmare.
Right, exactly. He says, I've been in the business for 45 years. Always felt like if I did my rapport building and building value, it was something I didn't have to do, which is the buyer brokerage agreement.
Well, what did you look for, Christian, when you were evaluating realtors? You bought two homes up in Georgia. I mean,
Yeah, I
did
bought homes down here in Florida as well. I think I need someone that can add something that I couldn't do myself. Either physically being available. When I bought my house down here in Florida, I wasn't physically here. I needed someone that was boots on the ground, that was kind of fighting for me. I also needed someone that gave me a lot of referrals, that could say, all right, here are 3 inspection companies, and here's the best title company I work with, and insurance, here's 5 options for insurance. I needed that. I also needed someone to say, hey, look at the natural light. This is where the sun's going to be coming in. That's when it's going to be the hottest. Not every realtor can bring that, but that was really nice because I was a newbie to Florida. I didn't really know. Um, that's how, and then I needed someone I could trust, someone that was more organized than me, someone that was more professional than me, because I'm trying to have fun. I'm trying to make this make sense. That's how I evaluate. And ultimately, I went with my gut. Um, so I think it's a really
your wife
interesting
didn't
thing.
even see the house that you bought before
Neither
you
did
bought it?
I. Neither did I.
Yeah,
We didn't see it until a month after closing when we had torn the whole thing up with renovation. So it was tough.
yeah.
David
I wasn't
mentioned
too nervous.
David has been, very into this lawsuit with NAR, and he says if sellers want to list with $0 buyer side commission, which is where these lawsuits are trying to go, they're trying to allow a seller to say, I'm not paying a buyer's commission. They may be willing to pay the buyer broker. Let's see. Let me see if I can read this right. If buyers want to list with $0 buyer side commission, but may be willing to pay the buyer broker commission, i.e., retain the right to negotiate the buyer side commission, what language would need to be in the realtor remarks or in the listing? So what I guess David is saying is he wants to be able to put zero, which right now you can't. In the MLS down here in Southwest Florida, the lowest you can put is $1. So let's say a listing agent gets cute or the seller gets cute and puts $1, but reserves the right to renegotiate. I wouldn't say anything I would just put it out there. And if, like you said in your experience, Dad, you were giving people this money up front and then hoping they wouldn't ask for more discounts.
I
I
gave
would
away too
go the
much
same way. Maybe you say, look,
online.
I'm going to put one and have it low. And if they ask, then I'll tell them. But if they don't ask and they just make an offer, then I don't have to pay them.
I might do 1.5, something like that. I mean,
It is
try to
custom,
be
right? Custom,
split.
it's going to be tough to sell a property in today's environment without paying the buyer brokerage commission. It's
Well, how
just going to
about
be a
in
tough
Georgia
sale.
again, Christian? Well, what kind of listing agreement would the seller sign?
It's 6% commission, half of it paid to the buyer's
When
broker.
you sold your condo and your house,
Yeah.
you signed a listing agreement agreeing to pay 6%, and
Yep.
that's in a state where you have buyer brokers agreements everywhere.
Exactly. And there are a couple of things going on with that. Number one, at that point, I knew a lot of agents in town, and I knew exactly who I trusted. That not only did I like the person, but I'd worked with them with their clients, and I had a lot of experience in that,
Right.
just doing their other closings. But I also needed them physically. I was going to be gone. So as much as I didn't see the new house that I was buying, I also didn't see the old house after I left. We just left, and the house had all the furniture in it. So I told my friend Stacy, who did the listing for us, I said, I'm not going to negotiate on commission. Said, I want you to close this for me, but you're going to have to pay for it. And I said,
Yeah.
it's not going to be free. And so
But
he actually helped coordinate with the
why would you do
mover.
that, Christian? Why would you do that when you know that the buyers are getting buyer brokers agreement? Because that's what's going to
Because that
happen.
that was that was the best way to get the highest offer.
So you netted out the highest dollar amount
I thought
still
so. I thought
with buyer
so.
brokers and a full 6% listing agreement.
Yeah. Now, if my listing agent was offering nothing, most likely the buyer who made an offer would have to take that in consideration. They would net out what they're going to have to pay their buyer's agent. So in that scenario, I'm thinking, all right, now I've just made it really complicated for the
See,
buyer.
this feels like the Butler case to me. It really does. It equalizes in the end. Sellers are still going to have to pay 6% if they want their property to be
Yeah.
moved.
Yeah.
Buyer brokers agreements become ordinary.
Yeah.
It'll actually protect the broker more.
I think the one learning point on this is use a buyer brokerage agreement. I would do it. I don't see why you wouldn't. I would start today. It's a great form. The only awkwardness is if a buyer says, "Well, what is this percent that I have to pay you?" Right? If you have that question, just role play it and know how you want to respond. But it's a
You have to show what value you bring into the equation. Like you were saying in Georgia, you wanted three alternatives for appraisers. You want three alternatives for everything. And the sun's coming in the window in the morning this direction and that
I
sort of
needed
thing.
an extra set of eyes because my wife and I were looking at it from one view, and I wanted someone who does it every day from a different view. Dad, you and I spoke about a different analogy. I was working, interning at the state prosecutor's office during
Right.
law school. And I said, I looked at all the defense
I
attorneys,
remember that. Yeah.
and I said, none of these guys are all that smart, or gals. None of them are all that smart. They're really
Don't get
not.
stopped on the way home.
But but they do it every day. They're in the courtroom every day of the week. They've seen 1,000 cases where they pled someone who had this down to that. And they knew that, not because they were intelligent, not because they learned it in school, but because they'd seen it
Yeah.
1,000 times. And I
It's
need
it's
that. That's
pretty smart.
valuable. It's very helpful information. So if I'm doing it myself, could I defend myself in a I don't know, reckless driving or something like that? Maybe, but I'll mess it up. I can promise you, because I don't see it every day. No idea
It's
what I'm
it,
doing.
it's almost like, do you want an average person with a ton of experience or a genius with none? I think I'd take the average with a ton.
Yeah, that's what I'm going for. That's who I am. All right, couple last points. Let me get through this quick. Yvette says, just to clarify, using a standard NABOR contract, can a buyer submit repairs and submit additional repairs 3 days later, as long as you're still within your due diligence period? No, you cannot. You only have one bite of the apple on a NABOR
You're
contract.
talking about the as is or the standard?
This is the standard NABOR contract. You get one bite of the apple. If you make that request, you can't make an additional
Yeah,
request
except for
for
the permit thing. They give you more time
yeah.
for that.
Permits are separate and only if you couldn't get it in time. But yeah, it's one bite of the apple on an as-is contract. As long as you're within your due diligence period, you could still back out. You could still renegotiate. You could do whatever else you need to do.
That's why the sellers need to have the buyer waive the balance of the due diligence once they give them something.
Right, right. All right. One last thing. I know I've already kind of hit the end, but maybe we could talk about this next week. This is the financing contingency. So I wanted to hit on this quick because I thought it was interesting. We had two examples come up this week. Number one, there was a loan denial at the closing table. And the buyer said, "Oh, I got denied. The lender is not happy with X, Y, and Z." And so the listing agent sent it to me and said, "Hey, what is this? I've never gotten a denial letter at the closing table. Can the buyer really get their money back?" And so the first thing is I had to look at everything. It's a FAR bar contract, and that matters. Now, Dad, the quick and dirty NABOR versus FAR bar on a financing. NABOR
With
just keeps
FAR,
going, right? And FAR
yeah,
bar, it actually expires.
FAR bar expires if the buyer does nothing, doesn't give any sort of notice within the loan approval period to the seller. It's deemed a cash closing, as though paragraph 8A was checked off. If they give notice that they have loan approval, or they don't have loan approval, but they're confident they're going to get it, then they're turned down at closing. If it's a property related condition, they get their money back unless it's appraisals,
Well,
appraisals.
there's a lot to it, but the quick and dirty NABOR, your
You got
contingency
to do
will actually
something.
continue. You're still protected as long as you haven't waived it. Whereas in a FAR bar, it actually expires given the date that they put in there. So in this particular example, it was a 35-day contingency on a FAR bar contract. And by the time we got to closing, the contingency had expired.
It's too late.
It's a cash deal at that
It's a
point.
cash
Too
deal.
late for the buyer to get a denial.
That's the
The
big danger of
second
that.
part on that is that it wasn't the right kind of denial. So even if it was within the financing contingency, the buyer didn't get denied for the right reason. And I'm not
We've
going to
had
get
two or
into
three
it.
of those this year, Christian.
We've had several. The buyers don't seem to understand what a proper denial is versus what is not. We'll have to get into that on a later date. I think I may even had another video about that exact topic.
Yeah.
But the denial matters. The types of loans matter. So if on your loan or on your financing contingency, you specify a conventional loan, but then you get denied on an FHA, yeah, that's a problem. That's not a proper denial.
There's cases out there that if they don't apply for the loan in the contract, under the FAR bar contract anyways, the contingency means nothing.
Contingency means nothing. And then there was another example. This one is on a NABOR contract. So if you remember, I was specifying that a NABOR contract does not expire. So what in this case, the listing agent was asking for a waiver. So the time period was up. They heard good news from the lender. They got some sort of like pre-commitment, pre-loan commitment, whatever that means. And so the listing agent said, "Hey, we need you to waive the financing contingency. You've gotten what you need. The appraisal came in. You're good. I need you to waive it." And so the buyer called me and said, "Oh, I'm just still kind of nervous because of X, Y, and Z. I think there was like a guarantor on the deal and all that." And I said, "Well, then don't waive your contingency." He goes, "Well, I have to, don't I?" Nope,
No.
you do
Yeah,
not.
a lot of people
What's
think
the
that's a breach
downside,
of
Dad?
way.
What's the downside?
Well, that the seller can terminate the contract
Right.
and sell to somebody else.
Right. So
So,
the worst that could happen, again, do you protect the deposit, or do you protect the deal? If you're
and
worried that the
sometimes it's the
seller,
timing, how long do you have to wait for the closing? Because I had this where the closing was 1 week later than when the waiver would have been done. And we just refused. And, in the time period, it would take the seller
yeah,
to terminate, relist it, sell it to somebody else, close, they would have lost 2 months and maybe
yeah.
not gotten the same money.
And if the seller terminates, the buyer still gets their deposit back. So unless there's another buyer in the wings that's willing to pay more, or if the seller's decided not to sell, then there's really not as much of a pressure for a buyer to waive it.
Yeah,
But
it's not a breach. It definitely
yeah,
is not.
We could talk all day about these topics. Those are three good ones, all jammed into one video. Thank you guys for sticking around and watching the whole thing. If you need us, call us. Right, Dad? That's what they're supposed to do,
Right.
right?
Anytime.
Yeah. All right. Bye, guys.